But you know, if you talk all the time, you'll never hear what anybody else has to say. And therefore, all you'll have to talk about is your own conversation. The same is true for people who think all the time. That means, when I use the word think, talking to yourself, subvocal conversation, the constant chit-chat of symbols and images and talk and words inside your skull. Now, if you do that all the time, you'll find that you've nothing to think about except thinking. And just as you have to stop talking to hear what others have to say, you have to stop thinking to find out what life is about.
All righty. Welcome to the first edition of the Stillpoint Show. We are here with Nicholas Paul. Nicholas is the founder and principal of Still Thinking, a new firm advancing a new field of practice for thinking near the technological frontier. He was a central figure at the Long Now Foundation for nearly a decade, holding a number of key leadership positions, including Director of Strategy and Director of Development. He is currently a fellow at the Institute in San Francisco. He regularly advises cultural entrepreneurs and frontier technologists, and he occasionally serves on select boards of directors. His background spans systems engineering and philosophy. Nicholas is also a dear old friend of both Francis and myself, and we're delighted to have him on to kick this show off.
It's an honor to be here, Brian. Thanks.
So we're just going to dive right in, and as we're conceptualizing this show, you know, the still point, like it's coming back to a center within each one of us through which we can then engage with the world from a calm, composed place of clarity. And from that place, what do we do? You know, and so sometimes we think, we decide to use our minds and think about things. And so we wanted to kick off this show with thinking about thinking. We're not even thinking yet, we're just thinking about thinking. And there's not a more perfect person to be chatting with than yourself about how to conceptualize the nature of thinking and especially thinking in these times. So with that, like, Nicholas, how do you understand like thinking in this day and age of technological acceleration, such a rapid pace that's going on in terms of innovation and different things related to geopolitics and the nature of our times? How do we get deep and clear with our thinking capacities?
I appreciate these light questions, Brian. Thank you. How do I think about thinking in these times? You know, I think, you know, we use the word thinking a lot. It's kind of a garbage pail term. We abuse it. If I asked you what 128 times 145 is, you might want to think about it for a minute. But we actually have a more accurate word for that activity. It's calculate. It's calculation. So, but we call it thinking, you know, or people will say things like, you know, I think healthcare is a human right. Well, that's more like belief or conviction. We have an accurate term for that thing that you're trying to describe, but we use the word think really casually. If I said, you know, think about a green elephant or something, that's more of an imagination activity. So what's thinking, you know, and I've got, there's lots of thought and discussion about that. Like, what are the origins of thinking? Where does it come from etymologically? Why do we have a word for this activity? And like, why do we have that? What is the activity that word points to? It looks like, you know, by some lights, it's related to the word thanking, right? So being thankful or grateful. And it's specifically like the second order gratitude where you're thankful to be thankful. So you can imagine a world in which, you know, hopefully everyone listening to this has had the experience of just being grateful to be grateful. Like, wow, I'm so thankful I can be thankful. When you're in that kind of contemplative headspace, you're very open to receiving things like insight and understanding. You know, we talk about things like shower thoughts. You know, people have these like aha moments, these eureka moments in the bathtub. Famously, you know, these things come to us when we're in this kind of open headspace. Our nervous system is relaxed, and we're kind of just in this kind of non-objective, contemplative space. You know, and so thinking is that. It's the being thankful to be thankful. It's that thing. That's thinking. We have a word for it. Now, this is obviously a little bit almost petty because no one's really using the term that way, but we all kind of know what that experience is. We can understand how thinking relates to that. So I think that's there. See, I'm using casually. I'm using I think that, you know. I think that's where we begin a conversation about thinking, is just recognizing that most of what we call thinking isn't thinking. The important one for us in this day and age, especially around technology, computation, AI, is to recognize that a lot of what passes for thinking is actually calculative thinking, and that meditative or contemplative thinking is kind of the antipode to that. So that's where I would begin the conversation, is just making a distinction between things like calculation, imagination, and thinking. And then, of course, I can say so much more about this. Importantly, I think we could talk about how thinking in this way that I've described it, what I would call like originary thinking, right? And not my term, but like originary thinking near the origins of thought. Originary thinking is in a relationship to something fundamentally mysterious. It's not really about knowing. It's about unknowing very often. It's about like realizing things you thought you knew well, you don't know well. That like letting go maneuver opens up the space for you to receive, right? In a certain sense, you can't hand somebody something when their hands are full, and you can't receive insight when you already know everything. You're not going to have any of these kinds of experiences that we think of as being related to thinking. Like, why would you want to think about a problem? It's like, well, because you want to receive thought. Again, I think a lot of our culture, especially here, I'm in Sausalito, so near San Francisco, where the whole Silicon Valley AI thing is kind of anchored, and a lot of what we think of as thinking here, or the products of thinking, is very like yang energy. It's thrusting things out into the world. It's constructing things. It's building and scaffolding. That's kind of when you come up with a white paper or some kind of prospectus or something, that's considered thinking. But again, in this vision that I'm sharing with you guys this morning, it's much more of a yin energy activity. It's much more of a receiving. It's a letting happen. There's a surrendering activity to it. So that's kind of what I think about when I think about thinking. I think about where is this activity still taking place today, especially when we're all just scrolling through things. We're constantly reading, we're listening to podcasts, we're talking to friends. We're very rarely in that thankful to be thankful headspace, or I should say, not so rare as to be scarce or non-existent, but it's just not a frequent modality for a lot of people. And so any thinking person is really familiar with this modality, and they protect it pretty aggressively. They block off things on their calendar, they take retreats, they close their door, they put on noise canceling headphones. They have ways of protecting the boundary that you need in order to think. But if someone's listening to this and this seems like a crazy thing, I of course recommend you try it. I think it'll be interesting to see what you receive.
I remember on my birthday, it might have been 8 years ago, you gave me a book by Heidegger called What is Called Thinking. And there's a line that's perhaps the most quoted line in the book, that, and you'll help me get it right if I stumble here. The most thought-provoking thing in our thought-provoking time is that we are still not thinking.
Yeah, exactly.
And there's a question, what does this mean, that we are still not thinking? And he's clearly implying that there's different types of thinking, and the thinking that is true thinking, the highest form of thinking, that we are not doing. And he wrote that book in, I think, the 50s, and it is probably more true today. It's so fascinating that in the age of AI, where there's clearly a almost universal consensus that intelligence is valuable in a utilitarian way, like in our capitalist consumerist society, that if we only had this holy grail, this elixir of life, if we only had this thing, which is unlimited intelligence on demand in our pockets, available to us at any time, then we could delegate all our work away, and we could fulfill all our wishes. It would be like having a genie in a bottle. We all want what AI promises it could become someday. We want that thing, and that thing is essentially thinking in a bottle. But there is the question debated in tech circles of like whether AI actually thinks or has the ability to or will ever do that. But there's actually the more ironic question, which is, are we thinking? And that is how I understand Nicholas's pursuit, And I think the best way to explain it to somebody is the scene from Star Wars where Luke hears Obi-Wan's voice in his head, and Obi-Wan's saying, "Luke, turn off your targeting computer, use the Force." In Buddhism, and Chan Buddhism and Taoism, which is what sort of inspired Lucas and all these things, there are these words, technical words for different types of thinking. Prajna, which is reason, and jnana, which is like an intuitive leap of insight or some sort of transcendent wisdom or a eureka moment. And so I guess, a follow-up question I have for Nicholas is, when, when an apple falls on Newton's head and he has his insight, or when Steve Jobs does LSD in India and like has some insight that turns into the most valuable company in the world someday, what is going on really? Because it's definitely not a targeting computer. It's definitely not an Excel spreadsheet. It's definitely not calculation. It's not belief. But what is the form of thinking that is true thinking? What is happening in the light bulb moment? Where do these ideas come from? How do you understand true thinking? You say thinking, it's somehow connected to gratitude, but like there's more to say there, I think.
Well, you're going to hate my answer, but I think it's everything else. Like it's just a negatively defined thing, or it can be negatively defined, usefully negatively defined, in the sense that the intelligence thing. I mean, here's a great definitional. What the heck does that supposed to mean? We could have a whole podcast about that, a couple podcasts. I think we've been having a conversation about that for like 1,000 years. But if we just take the general vernacular understanding of what that term means, it's fundamentally in relationship to knowing. There are things that an intelligent entity knows. It knows what George Washington's birthday was. It knows, how many gallons are in Lake Erie. It has a certain set of knowledge. And thinking is really it's the other side of that coin. It's the things we don't know. It's relating to the things we don't know. So when you look at these foundational models that have, hundreds of thousands of parameters right now, I don't know what the latest is, but like, you're thinking about like, okay, that's really cool. When we think about, let's back up for a second and think about the I Ching, right? Like one of these old texts that Francis and Brian and I have been talking about for a long time, and we're standing on the shoulders of many giants like Alan Watts and Carl Jung. Alan Watts' houseboat, by the way, is right there for the listeners, But, you think about the I Ching. Here's a text that's going to break the entirety of the world down into 64 things. It's basically a 64, you can think of it as like a 64 parameter, like way of knowing. And so now you're kicking that up from 64, so for anyone listening who doesn't know what the I Ching is, basically it's, there are 64 hexagrams. Each one of these hexagrams represents some state that the world can be in at a self-aware reductive sense. So it's recognizing that the world's very complex, but fundamentally you can kick it down to like 64 things if you really wanted to, in the same way that you could render a pixelated version of me with like fewer bits of information than I actually contain. And so like it's a pixelated version of the world. The I Ching is one way to think about it. And so you passed an I Ching reading and you end up in one of these 64 hexagrams, and that's supposed to give you some kind of information about where you are, some kind of prod to thinking about what your situation. Anyways, that's the I Ching for anyone who doesn't know. That's a 64-bit resolution thing. Or not 64 bits, but 64 states. And then you can think about these other things that have 100,000 states, or maybe even we get up to like 1,000,000 parameters. The question is like, how many parameters do you think reality has? Like, and this is why it's an unknowing thing. I don't know. I don't have a claim. I'm not claiming that like we're going to hit some limit or it's limitless. It just seems like the thinking thing is an activity that moves to those subtle infinities between these discrete states. So, it's the thing that's between two things. There's extensive infinities, right? When we think about like, so my houseboat here in Sausalito is 250 square feet, and we know that 500 square feet's more than that, and 5,000 square feet's more than that, and 5 million square feet's more than that. we can keep going extensively until we get to extensive infinities. But, there's also these infinities that exist between two states, between, the number 2 and the number 3. There's an infinity there. There's a subtle infinity that exists inside of these states. And you can imagine these like high numbers of parameter systems. Like there are things that are interesting in reality that slip between these states. In the same way, there's things about reality that slip between language. Like language is fairly discrete in a certain way, right? So poems are interesting. They're very complex ways of rendering reality. And some of them are really good. I mean, when you read a really great piece of poetry, you're recognizing that someone's nailed in language a very real thing, and it feels real, and it feels like it corresponds really well. And you're like, wow, maybe you've had that experience, or you can understand what the poet's trying to communicate. And maybe you're just in a state of mystery because you don't know what the poet's communicating, but you can get an optimal grip on it because of the language they used. But there's always something that slips between. And so, yeah, when I think about what, thinking in this day and age and like in this context, it's a negatively defined thing that's always going to move to the frontier of what knowing knows. It's about what do we not know and how do we relate to not knowing? Do we relate to it with a sense of fear? I mean, a lot of people do, right? A lot of people, if they don't know where the next paycheck's coming from, where the next meal's coming from, if they don't know stuff, people, our nervous systems get geared up, uncertainty's uncomfortable, and dealing with an infinite amount of uncertainty is paralyzing. So we need to at least give ourselves the sense that we know what's going on to some extent. But I think you can be humble about it and recognize that reality is way more complicated and way more both extensive and subtle than we can grasp, even us. But like that's the job that we're assigned to. We're gonna have to grok the reality. Now, if we want to use tools like shovels and shelter and fiber optic cables and transformers to do that, cool, that's fine. We can use tools to do it, but we're not relieved of the fundamental responsibility of like negotiating reality. And that negotiation doesn't care if you ran out of bits. The negotiation doesn't care if you ran out of shovels. Like, turns out negotiating reality is just you're either doing it or you're not doing it, and it doesn't really matter. Yeah, the AI thing doesn't change that at all. So in a certain sense, things are way different now. A conversation about thinking and knowledge and mystery and uncertainty is a very different conversation right now. And in some really fundamental and important ways, it's literally the same conversation that we've been having as a species, as a whatever the human thing is, for thousands and thousands of years. Which then means these texts from thousands and thousands of years ago, like the I Ching, which is one of the oldest texts on the planet, these texts then become more relevant. We can no longer dismiss them as pre-scientific superstition. I mean, sure, fine for category purposes, put them in that section of the library maybe. But there's this gnawing sense that maybe there's something relevant in this stuff from thousands of years ago. And that's a terrifying thought, that we haven't made any progress on fundamental human problems. Like it's comforting to know that whether it's like child mortality, vaccines, anesthesia, root canals, governance, like it's nice to think that we've kind of progressed along a path, and that there's never been a better time to be here than in the year 2025, when the light from my face is going into a machine, converting it into electricity that then goes through the sky to my Wi-Fi router, that then goes through a bunch of metal cables all the way till it gets to glass cables, all the way till the point where it goes to space, gets beamed back down. I imagine Brian's on Starlink in the middle of nowhere. So, it's like, this is wild to think about. Thousands of years ago when they were writing the I Ching, this would be unfathomable. And at the same time, we're still talking about this stuff. And it's kind of the way that Star Wars, you brought up Jedis. It's the way that Star Wars is really a Western movie, right? It's really just Western gunslingers, shooting each other all the way out in space. But fundamentally, the genre of the human is as relevant now as it was thousands of years ago. And the AI stuff actually doesn't make a big difference if we read it as that. Again, in other ways, it's completely relevant, and that's why we're talking about it.
Yeah.
The history of thinking about thinking is one of the subjects within philosophy, if not the entire subject of philosophy, epistemology. is I think the technical term for it. How do we know what we know? But also just existential philosophy in general, like the cosmology, like what is the nature of reality, the fundamental nature of being, this inquiry into what is truth, what is reality, is tied in a very weird way with the limits of consciousness and language. Like what is the question of consciousness and also language. So there's the name for this podcast, The Still Point, comes from T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets, where he talks about the still point of the turning world, which is, a beautiful turn of phrase, but also a great way of describing what philosophers do, but also what artists do and creatives do. He has another line in the Four Quartets where he says, "Words strain, crack, and sometimes break under the burden, under the tension, slip, slide, perish, decay with imprecision, will not stay in place, will not stay still." And so there's this, I hear in the back of my mind as we talk about these things that, you're always going to lose some of the audience who's like, why are we having this really abstract, really conceptual conversation about nothing? This is intellectual masturbation. This is not useful. What are we talking about here? And we're thinking about thinking. We're talking about the limits of language. It's like Descartes' line of, I think, therefore I am. There's this fundamental question of like the role of like the emergence of consciousness, whether consciousness is fundamental or whether it emerges from matter and energy and an evolutionary process. And I guess so just to ask a pointed question to Nicholas, like, will there ever be a final answer to these questions? There's probably, like, almost certainly not, because the nature of philosophy is to be unresolved. And so then there's a question of value. So then how do you then justify philosophy given that it is unresolvable? And how are philosophers useful to a society? They are, in a sense, alienated and estranged because they're doing this thing that, like, most people will just view as kind of irrelevant.
Well, how do I justify my mode of being? Is always a good genre of question to answer on a podcast.
Our mode of being, by the way, because
Yeah,
Brian and I, of course,
yeah.
also identify we're philosophers. We have to justify this
Oh
all
yeah.
the time to ourselves, not just
Oh yeah.
to the skeptic.
Anyone who's listened this far that we didn't lose in our discussion of the subtle infinities like 10 minutes ago, anyone who's still listening to this is probably relating to this phenomena that we all are familiar with. And so many things to say about it. I mean, on the one hand, you're right to bring up the concept of truth. Like, what does it mean? Like, the pursuit of truth, or I guess maybe the attempt to be honest, or to be authentic. This existential philosophy is swirling with terms like this, um is part of this. And to ask a philosopher why they have conversations like this, or why they trouble themselves with these questions, is like asking a chef why they make food, asking a musician why they play music, asking a teacher why they teach. It's like, fundamentally, when you get down to it with any of these folks, you can't have any of them on the podcast, they're going to say, I don't know, really. If they're honest, I think they're going to come up against the mystery of, I don't know, this is just always something I really loved. Or, I don't know, other people hated doing this, but I always really thought it was kind of fun, so I do it. I'm blown away that people will do what it takes to become a surgeon, right? I'm blown away that people do what it takes to, like, to build houses. Like, this is not stuff that I would consider to be like how I'd want to spend my time. Meanwhile, I can engage in these abstract conversations literally until I fall asleep, and often do, if it's a good day. I just do this until I pass out, and then I wake up and I do it again with you guys in the morning. So, like, why is that the case? I don't know. Like, I really don't know. I mean, I can definitely think of lots of other things that would be more lucrative, less terrifying, more interesting at dinner parties, certain dinner parties. Other dinner parties love this kind of stuff, So it's like you end up having to find your niche in the world that like somehow finds this to be useful and valuable. It's not always easy. If you're an accountant, it's very easy to understand and justify your choices. And no hate on accountants. In fact, I think I've been, thanks to David Foster Wallace and Something to Do with Paying Attention, which is a wonderful slim volume on the religious ecstasies of tax accounting. It's a great text. It's like, not to knock these other things that are more legible, just to say that like our culture relates to accountants in a way that it doesn't relate to philosophers. And accountants are never really called to justify their expenditure of attention, whereas philosophers are regularly called to justify it. Like, and especially economically, you think about like, how is a society that needs to grow food and build houses and basically produce, how is a society that does that, how do they countenance the existence of people who are experiencing the life of the mind? And there, we'd love to fantasize that maybe hundreds of years ago it was easier. You had gentleman's scholarship and I don't know, in Oxbridge or something. We like to imagine there was like some beautiful time when this was like more uh like legible to people, but I don't know if that was really true. And the number of people involved then was so many fewer people than are now able to get access to this knowledge, thanks to the internet, thanks to now like language models. It's like existential philosophy is probably more broadly accessible now than it's ever been, for better and for worse. It's like, what happens when everybody understands like deconstruction? It's like, well, then things get deconstructed pretty broadly. It's like, what happens when everyone understands hermeneutics? It's like, well, then you get a lot of hot takes. People are sharing their takes on everything. So was it a good idea to break open the tabernacle of wisdom and give it to everybody? It's like, yeah, we're gonna find out. For me personally, again, like my justification is just one that like I don't know. Like I can't really justify my existence in an ultimate sense. I don't have an ultimate grounding. This wasn't like a strategic thing. It was more of just like the increasingly as I learned to bullshit myself and the world less, this is where I ended up. Like, increasingly people go, oh, so what do you want to do for a living? And maybe when I was younger, I was like, oh, I don't know, become an engineer and like build stuff. And then like I did that for a while and just realized, no, I don't want to do that. The best parts of this whole experience have been these weird late night conversations about the nature of reality and what it means to be human. And it's like, okay, well, you do that long enough, you just get kind of good at it, especially relative to like baseline. The same as like, if you play the saxophone for a few hours every night for a decade, you're going to be pretty good at playing the saxophone. So this is just like another kind of playing the saxophone. I think of philosophy way less, Francis, the terms you used were like things like epistemology, like how do we know what we know? How do we justify knowledge? I think of, at least I think a healthy way of reading philosophy is to draw out that analog with music or aesthetics. I think philosophy fundamentally has to make a good sound. It has to be compelling. It has to be musical. There are arcs to the composition of a philosophical response. And when someone's doing it well, they're taking you on this journey that feels satisfying and has points of tension and points of resolution that feel balanced and feel like they were done by someone who's expert at this. And, maybe there's moments in this podcast where one of us lands on that. Maybe there's moments in this podcast where the audience is like, these guys have completely lost me. Same thing happens to a jazz record. Put a jazz record on. There's going to be moments where like you are locked in with the soloist, and there's going to be moments where you're like, this is just kind of background cafe music. They kind of lost me. That's just the nature of improvisationally being creative and sharing things with people. So I think thinking of philosophy like that is also helpful. It takes some of the weight off of it. Very often, we ask these big questions of each other, and it's like the fate of the universe, the fate of my existence as a human being, whatever that means, is dependent on the answer to these questions. So like the stakes couldn't be heavier. These are weighted questions that we ask each other when we have these conversations. And I think it's good sometimes to remember that it's a jazzy thing, or it should be. You can do it lightly. You can have a little jam session and see where it goes and see what comes out of it. Maybe something awesome comes out of it. And maybe you're just like you said, maybe it's just intellectual masturbation, but at its best, philosophy has a way of unlocking things inside of other people where like all of a sudden you realize you knew that you never would have said it that way, but like somebody said something, you're like, that's it, that feels right. Right is like an interesting concept here, right? So less than true. Think about, right action, right livelihood from the Eastern tradition. You think about right triangles, you think about Euclid, and then you think about like, what does it mean to like say something right? I mean, fundamentally, that's the game we're playing here is, can we say something right? I'm going to ask you a question. You're going to ask me a question. Can one of us say it right? And if we do this podcast, we're going to point people to it and say like, look, I really said it right there. Maybe that happens, maybe it doesn't, but that's the mystery. That's the not knowing in advance. If this was a rehearsed thing that we had written up and I'm reading the screen with my answer because I know that this answer is right because I spent like a weekend on it. If that was the way we were doing this, there's something not right about delivering the right answer. So it's almost worth the ante of possibly not getting things right. Like that's a precondition for getting anything right, is the risk that you might not. And that's what philosophers do. They hold space for this possibility. Like if you didn't have philosophy, there was nothing to talk about philosophically. The entire thing would just kind of crunch in on itself in a singularity. Like if there were no subtle infinities to unpack, if there was no extensive infinities to explore, then people would just know everything they need to know, and there'd be no point in the mystery, no point in contemplation, no point in having a still point in the turning universe. There wouldn't be a turning world. Like you would unworld the world. Worlding is a really important thing we do when we uncover these spaces, right? Worlds take up space, and philosophers are in the business of kind of creating space often where there isn't. At least one kind of philosophy, right? There's another kind of philosophy that can crunch it all down into a ball and toss it away. But I guess philosophy negotiates this stuff, is the way to say it. But the kind of philosophy I'm interested in these days is definitely about the creating space, creating worlds. We think about like being in the world of business, being in the world of AI, being in the world of jazz. There's a lot of worlds. That like, is it a better world where the world of jazz is solved? Can
Right.
you
You're
imagine?
you're
Yeah.
you're implying that the uncertainty and the undeterministic nature of the world is fundamental. That like if we lived in a certain world, if everything was knowable, there would be no need for individual consciousness, and not really much of a role for any consciousness at any scale because it's all solved. And and so the um, like what makes life in the world interesting is its unknown quality.
Yeah, it's why you keep doing the thing, is because there's something to do. If there's nothing to do, then you wouldn't be here. I mean, do you guys know what fix a flat is? Does anybody here know what fix a flat is? It's one of the many ways you can fix a flat tire. If you're ever traveling through the American West, put a can of fix a flat in your trunk. Trust me, you can buy it at gas stations. And what it is it's a
This
canister
is
like the
such a
size of
weird
this.
like ad that's somehow showing up in the middle of our podcast.
I don't
Who
I don't
paid
have
you
any
what?
equity in Fix a Flat. I don't have any equity in Fix a Flat, no contracts, nothing to disclose. But hear me out. Fix a Flat's an interesting metaphor for this thing, which is like it's a canister of pressurized gas and like a liquid rubberized goo. And what happens, like you imagine you're driving your car and you drive over a nail, and a nail puts a puncture hole in your tire. And so slowly you're leaking air, and that's bad. You don't want to have a flat tire eventually. So what do you do? Well, if it's not too bad, you can take one of these cans of Fix a Flat. It's got a little nozzle and it goes onto your tire's intake valve, right? Where you would pump up your tires, and you press it and it pushes air and this liquid goo into your tire. And the idea is that because your tire is a high pressure system and the system outside of it's a low pressure system, the goo finds its way to the leak. Like it automatically just goos its way over to the leak and then gums up the hole. And then it cures, and you've fixed a flat. That's why they call it fix a flat. So I think consciousness is probably something like fix a flat, and that you spray it into a situation and a bunch of solved stuff, you don't need to worry about it. But there's going to be a puncture hole. There's going to be the thing we don't know or haven't figured out yet or haven't explored. And I think consciousness kind of shows up at that site. And so the fact that we're here having a conversation means there's something here that we haven't figured out. Like, we're not going to discuss stuff we know. Like, known stuff is uninteresting to this particular kind of philosophical conversation. Like, I don't want to like have a conversation with you guys about like how plants turn sunlight into energy. But it's like a known thing. We can read the Wikipedia article, we can ask an LLM, we can like, that's not interesting. I'm much more interested in other things like what else does a plant do? Like, what other things do we not understand about plants? That's a fun philosophy conversation. But, trying to understand photosynthesis, less interesting for this particular genre of conversation.
Mhm.
This is one of the ways in which philosophy is actually very useful. The conversation I was having just before this was a group of board members, not in a board meeting, talking about, and the scope was, what are we not talking about? Because
Mhm.
if you think about a board meeting, you have a deck, and there's a clear agenda, and you're talking about all the obvious things. And
Yeah.
but the opportunities to create value are usually having a much more awkward conversation with a much smaller group of people, that is kind of like staring at a blank canvas, or like sitting in front of a wall and being like, all right, like what direction could we go in that we haven't thought of? What haven't we been talking about? Um, what are we not doing? Or like, what could we do? Or what is the wildest, weirdest idea that any of us can think of that could be somehow useful? And because that is an awkward question, because it forces a group to sit in silence, sort of, or at least to be comfortable with like the vulnerability of suggestion and
Yeah.
creativity, and then bouncing it around and sort of doing this improv thing, where really important people and powerful people that are status oriented and high prestige, it's kind of awkward to suddenly be throwing cans of paint at the canvas and getting messy. But actually, it was a really good meeting, because it was an awkward one and a creative one. And it's exactly that philosophy does. In a way, philosophy is the mother of all other disciplines, because it created the scope. So it says, well, what if there was a way of understanding the natural world? And how might we understand the natural world? A lot of the early scientific work was produced by philosophers. And there's in the history of science, you can debate it, and there is debate, but my argument would be that, like, philosophy gave birth to what we call science. Um, and this is true for pretty much every subject. Like, and from my point of view, philosophy gave birth to drama and literature as well. Like, I really do view it as somehow originary, um, because it is the most basic relationship the thinker has to thinking itself, that everything else comes from. So I guess there's a question then of like, well, what like what does this mean in the age of AI, which is your forte, Nicholas? And Brian, I don't know, where you want to take the conversation from here, but like, I really want to hear about this age in which we're not thinking what's going to happen, like.
Yeah, I'd love to add two elements to that question. So, in the context of AI, both from a personal standpoint of how we can understand thinking in relationship to these tools that are now utilized in so many different avenues of our everyday existence. I would love to understand, I would love to unpack that with you, Nicholas, as well as thinking about behind the scenes of the development of these tools and how thinking can actually go into the development of these thinking tools to support the evolution of thinking itself, both within the tools and within the sort of dyadic nature of human and AI interrelating.
Yeah. Yeah. How to dive into this. I think the thinking thing is going to be increasingly important. The philosophy thing is going to become increasingly important as these machines that are supposedly thinking are just doing so much. so good, right? Like AI is going to be so much better than you at doing so many things that we historically sloppily have thought about as thinking. That's why like some precision around the definition of thinking is kind of warranted at this moment. Because I can't have a clear conversation about what it is we're doing if if people think that what's happening inside of your brain is what's happening inside of a computer. Are there certain dogmas of the AI world that I think are going to age really poorly? And who knows? Like maybe I could be wrong. I'm not trying to be a futurist or a prophet about this, but this idea that there's like two ideas that stack on each other. One's that you are your brain. That's an interesting piece of dogma that a lot of people I think take for granted in spaces like neuroscience and technology and AI. You are your brain, and then that your brain is a computer. And then you can stack these together, and then you can be in a computer. Like that's the extension of this stuff. And that's why they kind of team up in this way that causes what I think of as like a lack of clarity in thinking, but also just it causes things like paralysis or anxiety or fear. And I haven't heard a strong argument for why we should create a world where people are all anxious and afraid. I don't know if that's like that seems self-evidently not good. And I don't know how much I have to justify that. Like, do I have to make an argument for why it's better to have people that are not anxious and paralyzed? I don't, hopefully it is its own argument. Sometimes I say to people that like, in the world of music, you get things like good jazz and bad jazz. And it's really nice that you don't have to police bad jazz because bad jazz is its own punishment, right? And I think on some level, technology should be read in this way too. It's like there's good technology and bad technology, and bad technology you're going to know because it's its own punishment. Don't do it. Like, don't do it. Don't stick your finger in a light socket. Don't touch the hot pan. And so are we going to be able to, as a species, as whatever we are as humans, conscious entities, the fix-a-flat, are we going to be able to continue to create things that feel good, that are their own reward? I mean, there's definitely ways in which technology is extremely rewarding. I think any of us who work adjacent to technology or in technology, we care about it. In fact, the three of us are kind of non-technical technophiles, right? We care about technology, but none of us really cut our teeth on linear algebra the way some other people, maybe some people who are listening to this do. And so it's weird to have philosophy type, humanities type people adjacent to technology. I think, right now there's this trend for folks like us, which is to say people who are constituted the way we are to ask the kinds of questions that we ask. There's a trend for us to either tuck into technical orgs as like philosophers in residence, artists in residence, in-house, whatever the hell. In which case, philosophers in residence are like fundamentally dependent on their residents. So like, how much can you really trust what these people are saying? Like, it's like on some level it's interesting, but there's limits to it. There's limits to what you're going to get out of a philosopher in residence to really be thinking about technology, especially technology that's relevant to that residence. At the same time, there's another route, which is to go into the kind of tech ethics, AI safety, think tank, think piece space where you fundamentally position the wisdom of the humanities as above technology, looking down on it, judging it, positioning it, making arguments for why it's good or why it's bad, kind of the critical discipline that comes from that. And that seems like a fairly toothless position because I don't know if a lot of this stuff, the future of a lot of this stuff hangs on that kind of critique. I wish it was being received better, but I see really great critique out there, and I just don't hear from technologists that a lot of it's landing or shaping their thinking too much. Now, again, with exceptions. I'm painting in some very broad paint strokes, and so I think what I'm seeing a need for is an eye level relationship to this stuff where you're engaged and you're proximal to technology, but you're not necessarily beholden to it. And you're not necessarily in this default critical mode where technology is the bad guy. And here's why. Here's an interesting way in which you didn't realize technology is a bad guy. You didn't even realize this. Now here's a new way. It's the bad thing. Like, I think both of those hierarchical positions, I don't want to say they're played out because again, like someone is so constituted that that's just who they are and what they're going to do, in both of these ways. I think I'm just, again, this is an extended justification of me and what I do with my time on Earth is like, I fundamentally like relationships of like, they look more like friendships, peerage, where there's like, what does it mean to have a friend around who has a different perspective than you? It's really interesting. And friends have really changed my mind. I mean, my relationship with Francis in particular, I use you as the example all the time when I'm talking about this, Francis, is like our relationship has really fundamentally changed and shaped who I am and how I've developed over, the decade or so that we've known each other. And I think that's, I don't want to speak for you, but I imagine that's a reciprocal feeling. And what's interesting about it is it's only reciprocal because we both were willing to ante in. Turns out your ability to influence people is directly, I think, proportional to your openness to being influenced yourself. If you're
Correct.
going to be recalcitrant and just criticize something, it's just not going to have the effect. But if you're going to enter into a relationship, a real relationship with stakes that's like, that goes two ways and is more like a friendship, it's like, oh, you stand a chance of like shaping things, but you're going to be shaped by that experience too. And so I'm kind of always curious, where are the thinkers, the philosophers, the humanities folks who are interested in that kind of a relationship where they can actually engage with technology in a way that shapes them, also shapes the technology, but there's real stakes to that, right? You're not safe. You're not up in an ivory tower pointing a finger. You're not throwing white papers over the fence. You kind of end up being there. You kind of throw your body up against the frontier with frontier technologists, and you're asking those questions together the way that you would with a friend. So I think that's kind of where this stuff is going. Philosophy, when I look around and see philosophy stuff, or when I meet someone who describes himself as a philosopher, you would think I'd be really excited, and I'm generally not, because I've generally come to recognize a lot of what goes under the banner of philosophy is really more like philosophy appreciation. And with all due respect to that, because I think it's important. It's important that people want to study that and teach that and continue that lineage. I'm much more interested in what is underneath that activity, like why philosophize and what's worth philosophizing about. And what do I feel called to think about? What do you guys feel called to think about? I think that's just more interesting for me. So again, this isn't to really criticize other philosophers. It's just the extended justification of why I'm occupying the strange position in the high dimensional existential universe that I am. And I guess I'm just in the same part of the universe as you guys, which feels great. I've got company. It's good.
We're very similar in all this. This is beautiful. Can we engage a little bit around the uh, whether there's any progress to be made? So I get to this place as I think about thinking, where I'm aware of time, big time, thousands of years of human history, and the line from the leopard seems very true. Everything has to change so everything can stay the same. And so, um, you know, is this is a little bit of a paralyzing insight. Like Nick knew me when we first met. I was in my late 20s, and I still had a whiff. That's more than a whiff. I was very much in the heroic mode of like, I'm I am a high agency person. I see problems in the world. I see opportunities in the world. I see ways of making the world a better place. And I'm going to do that because it's important that we solve the problems and create the ideas and create the value and invent the products and services and new systems that are going to make the world a better place and make people happier. And it's this, epic, it's like an epic movie or something, and you're living in it and it's your life. But if you zoom out further, through, this is why philosophy is it's a drug in a way. You have to be very careful. It's just don't, be careful about going down this journey. Even a small dose really, you zoom out and you're like, well, first of all, I'm a mere mortal. I'm going to die. And secondly, are we ever going to get to a place where all problems are solved? Can we even imagine such a world? Maybe not, maybe it is not possible, and then am I really capable of having a thought that nobody has thought before? Um, and and is thinking making me happy? So you sort of get around to this meditation thing. And so all three of us here meditate, where the thinking activity of the mind sort of peters out, kind of like a car running out of gas. And you're like, no, maybe I should stop this. Because it's not really getting me anywhere. And maybe I should just be. And you're sort of you realize that thinking might have a utility within a certain goal-oriented frame, but you start to wonder about whether thinking can lead towards wellness, or even thinking can lead beyond thought at all, and maybe moving beyond thought is really the the source of wellness. And so, do you think that it's possible that thinking is a disease in the same way that like progress and orientation towards progress is a kind of, illusion or a disease of the mind? And is there a goal to move beyond thinking? Why should we think at all, really? And having thought about thinking at the end of this podcast, maybe we should honestly just hit the off switch.
Yeah, that's a good provocation. Let's invert it for a second, right? If we're looking at disease, what's the opposite of disease? It's ease. And so where's ease? How can we find it? Think about caloric ease. Like, we have access to food that's kind of unprecedented. I can eat myself sick, the grocery stores are full. When do you stop? Well, you stop when it stops being ease, when you stop feeling at ease. And that's not fasting usually, right? Because there's a dis-ease that comes with not eating at all. And there's a dis-ease that comes with eating too much. So we're in this Goldilocks kind of construction, right? Where there's a sweet spot. And it's a relevant question. It's like, well, where's the sweet spot? Tell me, someone tell me, AI, tell me, chat, tell me, where's the sweet spot? And maybe you believe what it tells you. Maybe you do. But what happens if it tells you something and it doesn't work for you? This is a lot of people's experience with nutrition and medicine is, I'm doing all the things people told me to do, and I still don't feel at ease. Something's still up, It's like, okay, what do you do? Well, then that's where you're on your own. That's where you have to start exploring things. And so when I think about thinking as a disease, right, to get back, I swear I'm on the same path you set us on, Francis. When I think about thinking as a disease, it's I think obviously possible to think too much, to think yourself into a state of dis-ease. It's also possible to not think enough, like to just not be thinking. And then there's a sweet spot. And how do you navigate it? What's cool about meditation is it's got these kind of self-correcting bits to it where it's like, are you in danger? Like when you sit on a meditation cushion, are you in danger of meditating so much that you stop eating? Like, and you just never eat again? And like you just die of malnutrition? Not really. Why? Because there's other things that are there. Like it's going to start occurring to you that you should eat, and that's going to be a gnawing thing, and it's going to come in waves. And at some point, you're just going to eat. If you get too hot, at some point, it's going to occur to you it's too hot in here. You're going to open a window. Part of some advanced meditation practice is like saying no to that stuff. How do you create boundary conditions and actually just sweat and actually just feel the gnawing pangs of hunger and let it come and go, right? So one. I mean, I guess what I'm saying is one can arguably meditate too much too. And the question becomes, well, how much thinking, not thinking, being, doing, what's the right spot? I don't think there's an answer to that. If there was an answer to that, we wouldn't be here. That's the fix-a-flat thing. We're only here because this is where the nail hole is in the tire, right? The universe doesn't know how much to meditate. So it's leaving that problem up to you, Francis. You've got to figure out how much meditation is the right amount. And the stakes are high. It's the existence of the universe. You better figure this out. This is both like terrifying. It's a crippling amount of responsibility. And it's also, it can be carried really lightly because you can just play with it. You can explore things. You can try stuff. But can you imagine, it is possible in meditation sometimes to, like, let's say I commit to meditating for an hour. This is kind of my practice, is to give it a solid hour. And if I sit there for an hour, what happens when the UPS guy knocks on my door? Well, I just hear the UPS guy knocking at my door. What happens if he knocks again because he can see in the window that I'm clearly at home? Like, how many times do I let this guy knock? This is a real problem. I have this all the time. How
Wow.
many times do I let this poor guy knock on the door while I just sit there? I can hear him. I can hear him. He knows I can hear him. He can see me. I don't have AirPods in. I'm not, blocking my senses. He knows that I'm there. How many times do I let it happen? Well, for me, I've already committed. I'm going to let this happen until he goes away. Like, it's going to be a willpower contest, and the UPS guy has other packages to deliver. He's going to mosey on and leave it on my doorstep. But have I missed like signature packages because of this? Oh yeah, It's absolutely happened. Is that ridiculous? Is it ridiculous for me to now have to make a trip to a central holding facility to get my package because I was stubborn and just sitting? No, because my commitment to meditation was I've decided an hour is good. And that's a commitment, and I'm going to see it through to that thing. So that's the thing I've decided, and it's sometimes inefficient. And you can imagine people that think I'm crazy. That guy, the guy knocking on the door 6 times when he can see me, definitely thinks I'm absolutely nuts.
Now
And
you're
from
thinking his thoughts in your head. You're thinking this guy's thinking I'm crazy or I'm an asshole or whatever.
yeah, these are the stakes. These are the stakes of deciding how much thinking is right and how much thinking isn't. So I know lots of people here in Silicon Valley that they're so smart. They're so smart. It's like living in an Olympic village for smart people. It's great. I love it. I'm constantly the dumbest guy in the room, and it makes me really happy. And at the same time, you see a lot of people that are thinking, and they're thinking themselves into real distress, real disease. It's actually kind of common. And to those people, you want to say, oh, try sitting on a meditation cushion and relinquishing your commitment to following these thoughts where they lead in succession. You don't have to do the thing where you just follow this train of thought everywhere. You can just let go of the train. That's probably pretty helpful for them in the sense that it's nice if you're like going to the right, it's nice to turn to the left. It's like UPS drivers. Speaking of UPS, also not an equity holder of UPS, but UPS cars. Somebody told me once that like they had basically run a study for insurance purposes or something, and they only let UPS drivers turn to the right. I don't know if this is apocryphal. It sounds like it might be apocryphal, but basically they couldn't take left-hand turns. Like they had figured out that left-hand turns, big problem for UPS drivers on net, like at the systems view. When you like see it like a state, we can't let people take left turns. So they're only taking right-hand turns, which of course in a 2D flat plane, you can get anywhere with just right turns. It just takes a little longer, but you can outlaw left-hand turns. But at the same time, when we want to have a sense of freedom when we're navigating a two-dimensional thing, we want to be able to go to the right and we want to be able to go to the left. It's important to be able to do both. I feel like meditation is the equivalent of a steering wheel that goes to the left. And like a lot of what we consider to be like intelligence or smarts or like, thoughtful people, thinking people, smart people, they're really good at turning to the right. So if you're really good at turning to the right, it's probably good to train your ability to turn to the left just so that you can more efficiently get to where you want to get. It's a navigational thing. It's almost an athletic metaphor. You want to be able to access certain places in hyperspace, and you could do it by just doing whirligigs to the right. You can think your way. I mean, you can think your way to a lot of the places that meditation leads you, and I think you can probably meditate yourself to a lot of the places that thinking leads you. So I think it's not that one of these is good and one of these is bad, but it's that these are important muscles to train, if I can use that metaphor, for expert navigation or efficient navigation, or maybe even just aesthetic navigation. Maybe it's not about any of this stuff. It's just there are more and less beautiful routes through the mountains, and being able to meditate helps you take a more beautiful route. Maybe. It might be that's a low stakes way of phrasing it because it's just art, right? Art is always low stakes. It's just art. We're just making jazz. When you're talking about ways of knowing and thinking and disease, this is like heavy, but it's isomorphic with the light thing. And I think sometimes, especially when people are thinking about AI and existential philosophy, there's a natural tendency for everyone to ramp up the heaviness of it because it gets clicks and it raises funds. What a great fundraising pitch. If you don't give me trillions of dollars, the world ends. That's the best fundraising pitch I've ever heard. Who's not going to
Yeah.
give that person the money,
And if
And
you
yet,
do
like,
give me money, I will solve all the problems in human history. Yeah.
it's a great pitch. It's good work if you can get it. Got to respect the game to some extent. But, again, like I think there's a lightness that's missing in this conversation. And I don't mean a lightness in like a trivial sense. I think these are graded questions and have real stakes. But that doesn't mean, I don't know if that helps us. It's kind of like climbing a high ladder. It's like, how much does looking down help you? I don't know if looking down is the move. It's not that I can't look down, and it's not that once in a while you want to like do a reference check and kind of see where you're at. But if you're focused on the downward fall, then I just don't, again, I think of ease and disease. I don't think you're going to be in a state of ease. And it becomes a question of, do you think people do things better when they're in a state of ease, or do you think people do things better when they're in a state of disease? Can you squeeze insights out of people? or do you have to let the insights come to people? I mean, meditating is extremely comfortable, right? It is a luxury. It means you're not building something, you're not making something, you're not planting seeds, you're not painting your house, you're not producing papers. Like, you're fundamentally not doing anything. I mean, Francis, I've said this with you before in another fireside chat, but imagine I had a device in my pocket that would give you, a high-powered executive with lots of things on your plate, a 25th hour of the day. Just imagine I had that. Think about the money that executives spend on basically making their time more efficient, whether it's getting your dry cleaning done at the hotel or getting on a plane, right off the tarmac. Like, no matter what it is, imagine the things that executives pay for, so they can be more present in the places they're needed. Now, imagine I just took all of that and gave you a 25th hour. What would that be worth? What would that invention be worth to people in the economy? Like, trillions of dollars, surely, surely. And it would be, you see those shirts or those coffee mugs that say you have the same 24 hours as Beyonce. And this is supposed to be, I guess, motivating. I don't know. I don't know what I'm supposed to get out of that insight. I don't think they're the same, for whatever it's worth. I think Beyonce's got a few things going that I don't. But like, this idea that, like, what if you didn't have the same 24 hours as Beyonce? What if you had 25? That gives you this kind of edge that would be extremely valuable. Now, meditation is the opposite of this. It's a device, a thing that gives you 23 hours of a day. If you meditate for an hour a day, which is what I try to do, that means fundamentally everything I do in life, all competitions I enter, all projects I undertake, I have to accomplish what I want to accomplish with one less hour of a day than just about everyone else on the planet. That's an insane negation of value. It's like a potluck dinner, right? I'm just demonstrating that I can do this in 23 hours. It's cocky a little bit, right? Meditation is to say that I've planted enough, that I've thought enough, that I've organized enough, I've messaged enough. I'm going to sit for an hour. It's kind of a wild thing, and I think that's why people have a hard time with it. Is like, on its surface, like, talk about justification. How do you justify doing nothing? The world's burning. There are active war zones on the planet. Climate change is happening, and AI eschatology is running rampant. And like, there are so many things that need you and your talents and your attention, and you're just gonna sit down and pay attention to the breath coming in out of your nose? Are you crazy? How could you do that? How do you justify that? But this is where I think the work is. That's the fix a flat thing. Is like, how much should you be sitting? I think most of us, if you feel a sense of ease on the other side of meditating, you were probably doing too much before you got on your cushion. There you go. Maybe the right amount of doing stuff is not 24 hours a day. What if the right answer is like why shouldn't the answer be 4 hours a day? I don't know. You don't know unless you try it. If I was only doing stuff for 4 hours a day, I'd go nuts. I don't
There's
think I'd be.
There's a preposterous possibility, which is the person who spends 23 hours a day, sleeping or meditating, and then in that 1 hour does something so shocking, so brilliant, so transcendent that it creates more value than the person who is busy.
That's right.
It reminds me a bit of the story of Mary and Martha in the Christian Gospels. Like, Mary's very busy doing the dishes, and or Martha's very busy doing the dishes, and Mary is sitting listening to Jesus teach. And there's like a sense of like, where is the transcendent position? And because nonlinear leaps are possible, because even though Beyonce has 24 hours in a day, she's doing more with it. Maybe it's just natural gifts. That might be the case. But some people, it's not just natural gifts. It's the cultivation of the mind, not just the mind, the whole being, which the mind is part of the complex of, that make them masterful. And that pursuit of mastery involves receptivity, I think, where it can't just be all exertion. Like, there does need to be a bit of like receiving, antennas open. I'm ready for new ideas. I'm ready for a thought to come from somewhere outside of myself, because I'm in a gridlocked, I'm in a traffic jam in my own mind. I want to break out of it. And I think that's a really powerful position to put yourself in. So Brian, how should we wrap this?
Well, I think that's a wonderful point to kind of come into some closing reflection. Maybe Nicholas, if you want to offer any insights or invitations for our audience to think about how they might come into more ease, more potential to navigate turning right and left, going backwards if they need to at times. Any just final words as we leave our audience with something to think about until our next show?
I was just getting warmed up. I can't believe we're ending this podcast here. This is, well, can I get invited back? I have more to
Yes.
say. I have more to say. As far as like, yeah, what kind of salubrious advice do I have for the audience? I mean, I don't, I don't know, guys. Uh, I think if you've never meditated, yeah, you should give it a shot. Try it out. I think that's a lot of people actually who haven't really maybe given it like the straight college try. And there's so many resources available now for like kind of gently getting into it. You don't have to like raw dog an hour with the UPS guy knocking on your door. Like that's consider that advanced practice. Maybe I'm bragging a little bit here. Let's just try something easy. I mean, even 5 minutes is kind of wild, what it can do. 10 minutes, in the middle of your day. Things like Headspace or Calm can be really, really good for guided meditations, just on demand when you want them on your phone. So like meditation's a cool thing to learn. And I think the more intelligent and thoughtful, more yang energy your thinking is, the more you'll probably just benefit from having that other kind of that ambidexterity that comes with being able to meditate. So I would recommend it. A very close analog is just reading thick, dense paper books, which is also just like exercise of mastering attention and setting the clock pace differently than other people, right? Like TikTok or Instagram, or even like a Substack, even like longer form stuff. They're great, and I get a lot of value out of these services, so I don't want to knock them, right? I'm not like a Luddite or anything, but at the same time, they have a different cadence to them. There's a different like BPM to thinking in these cadences. Slowing that down, like you don't have to go all the way to nothing and meditate and like blank your mind out. Just slowing it down can be really valuable and help you identify a point of ease. So for me, sometimes when I'm stressed, even just sitting down with a thick book ends up being what I need. I don't necessarily need to turn my brain off, but I need to slow it down a bit. And the hope is that, again, if you take the athletic metaphor for attention, the hope is that once you've trained yourself to be able to kind of explore the spectrum of speeds here, speed, analog, whatever that means, between like TikTok and meditating. Once you can do that, then you can kind of negotiate where you want to be at all kinds of times. So you can actually follow a dynamic position of balance. Because, we're talking about this Goldilocks zone of ease and disease. Like that Goldilocks zone is going to move. You're not going to find it and be done. As soon as you find it, it's going to move over here. That's why you need to have the steering wheel that goes right and left. So I think training yourself all along the spectrum of attentional rates can be really helpful. And if you haven't done it, do it. You've probably already done it. If you've listened to this much of a podcast, you probably have a pretty healthy attention span. We've been yakking about abstract things for over an hour. So that would be my closing advice, would be just train yourself up the entire spectrum if you haven't. And if you have, I don't know, tune in for the next podcast they invite me on. I'll have more advice then.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Nicholas, for taking
Loved
the
it.
time. Francis,
Thank you, guys.
as always,
Thank you, Brian, for
pleasure.
hosting. Co-hosting this with me and Nicholas. There was no question. We were like, who's the first guest going to be? It was definitely always going to be you. There's so few people who can take the left turn, so to speak. We're so focused on maximizing utility and making progress and building and building and building for what? Towards what? And the ability to step out of the system for a second and think about the nature of reality, the nature of the mind, what it means to be human, what consciousness is, any of these bigger questions that have been playing out for centuries and millennia, and then to rethink them now in our time, because they are fresh ultimately, and we do need to renegotiate our own existence and re-ask them. You are the best person I know for doing that. So thank you for bringing us back into the great conversation and helping us find the still point in the turning world.
An honor, Francis. Thank you. Thank you, Brian.
Beautiful.
Thank you, everyone who's listening. Appreciate it.
And the moment you stop thinking, you become into immediate contact with what Korzybski called, so delightfully, the unspeakable world. The most ordinary sights and sounds and smells